Hello, class. The topic of today's lecture is Christopher Marlowe, a particular favorite of mine, and his just absolutely delightful poem, Hero and Leander. Isn't that marvelous? I don't know how a painting like this gets misplaced and goes unnoticed for centuries, but it was discovered in the 1950s at Corpus Christi College, Cambridge. And because the painting is dated 1585, and because Marlowe was a student at Corpus Christi at that time, and because the artist identifies the sitter in the top left corner of the panel as being 21 years old, which is how old Marlowe was in 1585. Many today believe the portrait to be Marlowe, but so far scholars have been unable to verify that, and not everyone accepts that identification. It is a striking image, though. It smolders. The charry doublet with the reddish orange fabric peeking through the panes like flame. It's an outfit perhaps too luxurious for the son of a provincial shoemaker, and but the floating hair, which reminds me of Coleridge's lines from the conclusion of Kubla Khan, and all should cry, "Beware, beware!" His flashing eyes and floating hair. All these details are certainly consistent with the popular image of Marlowe as a violent man, a dangerous man, and a rebel genius. Before I proceed with a chronology of Marlowe's life and literary career, it is interesting to make a couple of points of comparison with Shakespeare. Marlowe was born just a couple months before Shakespeare in 1564, but their life trajectories, Shakespeare and Marlowe's trajectories, are very different. Marlowe's brief but very brilliant career was over before Shakespeare's first appearance in print. Venus and Adonis appeared in 1593, and that was the year that Marlowe was killed. And the differences between the two men are quite striking. Shakespeare, by all accounts, lived a relatively safe, cozy, middle-class life. He was a successful entrepreneur. He married and had children. He died with a clean reputation. Marlowe accomplished none of these things. His life was scandalous, unpredictable, violent, and shrouded in a dark mystery, which is part of his appeal today. So, like I said, he was born in 1564. He was born in the cathedral town of Canterbury to a shoemaker named John Marlowe and his wife Catherine, and he was educated at the King's School. So, like Shakespeare, who was educated at one of King Edward VI's new grammar schools, and Spenser, who was educated at the Merchant Taylor's School under the mastership of Richard Mulcaster. Like them, Marlowe benefited from 16th century educational reforms that made it possible for middle-class boys to receive a rigorous classical education and preparation for university study, which is where Marlowe found himself by the early 1580s. He was at Cambridge on a scholarship that was intended for students preparing for a career in the ministry. He's reading classical poetry at this time, and probably, we don't know exactly when he was translating Ovid's Amores, but probably during this period, because they had been published for the first time in a modern Latin edition while Marlowe was a student at Cambridge. So he would have been exposed at that time And that's probably when he began his translations and imitations, which weren't published until many years after his death, um, in the late 1590s. And so controversial were these poems that they were actually burned. Um, so whereas Spenser, we can compare Marlowe to Spenser a little bit too. Spenser had taken Virgil, the Latin poet Virgil, as his model, writing pastoral poetry in preparation for writing the grand national epic, The Faerie Queene. But Marlowe deliberately chose a different route to the same end. He chose the more controversial poet, Ovid, translating and imitating Ovid's erotic elegies, rather than working in the pastoral mode to work towards epic, of which his Epyllion, Hero and Leander, although it's incomplete, it offers a really tantalizing glimpse of where Marlowe was headed. In 1587, he qualifies for a master's degree, but's denied due to rumors that he planned to leave Cambridge and join a group of dissident English Catholics in France. So he is denied his degree. But then mysteriously, and these documents survive, the Queen's Privy Council intervenes on the grounds that he had been, and I'm quoting the letter here, employed in matters touching the benefit of his country. Now, this is a really fascinating document. What could a young commoner, the son of a shoemaker, be doing in the service of the Queen? And he's a young man, and his background is very humble. So one theory is that at this time, Marlowe had befriended another young poet named Thomas Watson, with whom he gets into some trouble a little later. And Watson's patron, Thomas Walsingham, was the cousin of Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State and spy master, Francis Walsingham, whom you see here. Now, this is the late Sir Philip Sidney's father-in-law. Philip Sidney had died a year earlier in 1586. But this is Francis Walsingham. And in the late 1580s, there was growing concern of Catholic plots to assassinate the Queen, and Walsingham was given permission and resources to expand his spying operation, both domestically and on the continent. And so he was looking for informants and double agents. And Marlowe, a highly intelligent, literate, relatively unknown commoner, would have been an ideal recruit for this purpose. So the theory is, and again, there's no concrete evidence to support this, but the theory is that Marlowe was introduced to Walsingham through his connection to Watson and was engaged in various espionage activities until he became a liability to the state, which may have been motive for his murder in 1593. 1587 was also the year that he probably completed his two-part tragedy, Tamburlaine the Great, in blank verse. It would be published later in 1590 in quarto format. Marlowe was not the first dramatist to compose in blank verse. That credit goes to Norton and Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville. Their tragedy, Gorboduc, was performed in 1561 and then later published in quarto format in 1565. And Marlowe was just an infant at that time. But Marlowe's mastery of blank verse in Tamburlaine the Great especially was widely acknowledged at the time. And in 1623, in Ben Jonson's prefatory verses to the first folio of Shakespeare, Johnson famously called blank verse Marlowe's mighty line. So that's quite a tribute to appear in the first folio of Shakespeare's plays. So in 1589, there's this bizarre, very violent incident. Marlowe is involved in a street altercation with a man named William Bradley. Marlowe's friend, Thomas Watson, whom I've already mentioned, intervenes and kills Bradley, stabs him with his sword. And so Marlowe and Watson are arrested. They are briefly jailed in Newgate Prison, but they get off on a plea of self-defense. But this may not have been a random incident, and it may in fact have been a deliberate hit. William Bradley owed money to a man named John Allen, who was the brother of the actor Edward Allen, who was the lead actor of the theater company The Admiral's Men. And Edward Allen played the lead in several of Marlowe's plays, including Tamburlaine the Great. So Marlowe may have deliberately provoked Bradley to provide the pretext for Watson to kill the man, so they could argue self-defense. One of several violent incidents in Marlowe's lifetime. In 1592, he's in the Netherlands. Perhaps, since an Englishman would have to get permission from the Privy Council to travel to the Netherlands, he may have been there again in his capacity as a spy or a double agent. He is arrested in Flushing in the Netherlands for counterfeiting English currency and foreign currencies too, to bankroll a Catholic plot to undermine the British government. Now, this was a very, very serious offense. Counterfeiting was a capital offense. You could be executed for it, burned, I believe. And so this was a very, very serious charge, and yet somehow Marlowe gets out of this, and he's back on the street shortly after. So again, the idea here is that the reason Marlowe, the reason that this was overlooked is because Marlowe was actually acting as a double agent. He was trying to infiltrate these clandestine Catholic insurrectionist groups. Was basically let go on this charge. Nevertheless, other rumors begin to swirl around Marlowe at this time, including accusations of atheism, another capital offense, sodomy, another one, and a lot of these accusations were coming from fellow poets, curiously enough, and also libel against Protestant refugees living in London. By 1592, all of Marlowe's major plays, The Jew of Malta, Edward II, Dr. Faustus, all of them had been completed and probably performed by this date. In May of 1593, Marlowe was summoned by the Queen's Privy Council to account for all these rumors, these accusations against him. Probably already found guilty, probably already going to be punished for these offenses, but before he can report to the Privy Council, he is stabbed to death by a man named Ingram Fraser, allegedly over an unpaid bill at a tavern in Deptford on London's South Bank. Ingram Fraser and the other men that were with Marlowe at this tavern, all of them were involved in the espionage circles of the court of Queen Elizabeth. So one theory is that Marlowe simply knew too much, and he was dispatched in a way that would be a little more inconspicuous, I suppose, to be to be killed in a brawl at a tavern, which was not inconsistent with Marlowe's MO. He'd been involved in several other fights prior to this. But again, we don't know exactly what happened here, but it certainly has been fodder for speculation over the centuries. After Marlowe's death, Tamburlaine the Great had been published in his lifetime, but most of his other works appeared posthumously. Hero and Leander appeared in 1598, published by Edward Blunt. Two other editions appeared in 1598 with continuations. That is, since Hero and Leander was never completed, other poets took it on. Most famously, the most famous continuation is by the poet George Chapman. And in some editions of Hero and Leander, these continuations are included with Marlowe's text. In 1599, Jaggard publishes The Passionate Pilgrim. All the poems in that collection are attributed to Shakespeare, including one by Marlowe titled The Passionate Shepherd to His Love. It's not titled that in Jaggard's Passionate Pilgrim, but it received that title later, and that's how the poem is known to us today. And in 1599, his translations of Ovid were burned by episcopal order. Later, the Amores of Ovid would be published as all Ovid's elegies, I think in 1602. In 1604, his most famous work, Dr. Faustus, is published by a man named Thomas Bushell. There you see the 1604 title page. This is the A text. So this is the shorter version of the play, which is actually the one that most scholars prefer, but the longer B text that came out over a decade later, also in quarto format, has some interesting variations and additions to it. And is considered valuable in its own right. So we'll talk now about Hero and Leander. Here's the title page for Edward Blunt's 1598 edition of the poem. Again, this was a poem that didn't appear until 5 years after Marlowe's death. He is identified on the title page there, Christopher Marlowe, with a curious spelling of his name. The dedication page is interesting. There's a dedicatory epistle, which was common at the time, to the Right Worshipful Sir Thomas Walsingham. And that's important because Thomas Walsingham was the cousin of Queen Elizabeth's Secretary of State, Francis Walsingham, who had died in 1590. And we talked about this earlier in the chronology. But the man who murdered Marlowe, the man who stabbed him in the head, his name was Ingram Fraser. He was a servant of Thomas Walsingham in 1593 and returned to Walsingham's service after he was acquitted of the murder by the Queen and her Privy Council. So interesting that Hero and Leander would be dedicated to him. In line 52 of the poem, Marlowe identifies his source for the story as, quote, divine Musaeus, end quote. This was sort of a legendary figure, a pupil of the mythical poet Orpheus. Marlowe may not have been aware at the time that in 1583, about a decade earlier, from the period he was working on this poem, that scholars had determined that Musaeus's poem was actually written by a 5th century grammarian. Even George Chapman, the poet George Chapman, who completed Marlowe's fragment in 1598, clung to the idea that the poem predated Homer. Regardless, Musaeus's Hero and Leander was highly regarded during the Renaissance and had been circulating in Latin since its first publication in Venice in the late 15th century, though never translated into English. Marlowe's version is not a translation. Marlowe's is twice as long as Musaeus's, and he doesn't finish the story as Musaeus does. Marlowe's is more of a loose imitation and expansion on the original, with some elements borrowed from Marlowe's favorite Latin poet, Ovid. So the Epyllion, or mini-epic as it is sometimes called, is a type of narrative poem that was popular during the late Roman Republic, so the 1st century BCE. The most celebrated example of this form comes from Catullus, and it's written in the dactylic hexameter lines of ancient epic poetry. Both Homer and Virgil wrote their epics in dactylic hexameter. However, rather than recounting the grandiose Homeric narratives of divinely refereed warfare and arduous journeys, Catullus uses the verse form to treat romantic subject matter. His poem briefly tells the story of the marriage of Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis. These were the parents of the Greek hero Achilles, although over half of the poem's lines recount the story of the Minoan princess Ariadne's desertion by her Athenian lover Theseus after she had helped him to escape from the labyrinth and the Minotaur. Catullus's reputation for erotic wit, a number of his surviving lyrics are addressed to a mistress named Lesbia, made his poetry especially attractive to classically educated Renaissance poets writing within the Petrarchan tradition. Besides Marlowe's Hero and Leander, we also have epillia from several of his contemporaries, including Michael Drayton, his Endymion and Phoebe, and of course William Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. So in Hero and Leander, Marlowe uses the conventions of classical epic to treat amorous subject matter. In the epics of Homer and Virgil, for example, divine beings come down and intervene in the lives of mortals and often have a direct hand in shaping their destinies. So in Marlowe, the sea god Neptune attempts to seduce and later kill Leander. Marlowe also emulates his forebear's penchant for formulaic epithets like amorous Leander or the sapphire-visaged god describing Neptune. There are epic similes too, like the comparison of Leander's hot passion for Hero when they are separated. He goes back to Abydos, his hometown, and they're separated. He compares his growing passion for her when they're separated to the blazing sun at midday. Really good example of an extended simile in the poem. You can find that at lines 607 to 612. Finally, the proclivity of epic characters toward long declamatory speeches is replicated in Leander's impassioned harangues to Hero from lines 199 to 328. And we're going to look very closely at those speeches in a few minutes. The poem is written in iambic pentameter with a mixture of open and closed couplets and masculine and feminine rhymes, and some of Marlowe's rhymes are extraordinarily precious. They're just delightful. I particularly like the rhyme sophister and accosted her. That's 197 to 198. Or another example is Furious and Prometheus, 437 to 438. So sometimes students ask, where does this take place? Somewhere in ancient Greece is the answer. Here is a mid 18th century map of the Mediterranean basin. You can see the colorized section in the middle there is the Peloponnesus of Greece, and then off to the left is Italy and the Ionian Sea, and then the Aegean off to the right. And the story of Hero and Leander actually takes place in a region that today is Asiatic Turkey. And I'm going to blow that section up, enlarge it just a little bit so that you can see this strait that goes from the Mediterranean in towards the Black Sea. Very important, a very important shipping lane, even today, called the Hellespont. It's maybe 3 miles wide at its widest point. In 1810, the Romantic poet Lord Byron famously swam across the Hellespont from the European side to the Asian side. He tried it twice, in fact, and failed the first time. The water was too cold, so he tried again a little later successfully, and then bragged about it for the rest of his life. He wrote a poem commemorating the event, and he mentions it again in Don Juan. Lord Byron loved Greece. He died there, in fact, in 1824. He was involved in the Grecian Revolution. He got sick and died and was shipped back to England pickled in a barrel of whiskey. The town of Cestus here, that's where Hero lives in the poem, and then Leander is from the town of Abydos across the Hellespont. And this is important because in the poem, like I said, he swims across it, and in Musaeus's version, Hero lights a lamp at night to serve as a kind of lighthouse to guide him across, and the lamp either blows out or she falls asleep and it burns out. There are different versions of that story. And Leander loses his way swimming across and drowns. And when she discovers his body, she throws herself into the ocean as well. So it is a tragic story, although in Marlowe's version, we never get there. So here is I think it's helpful to have a synopsis of the poem. It's fairly easy to do. Lines 1 through 90, we get these physical descriptions of Hero and Leander, and we'll talk about these a little bit later. Lines 91 to 130, this is the festival of Adonis, and we get a lot here about the effects of Hero's beauty on not just on Leander, but on the people of Cestus. Lines 131 to 160, Hero performs sacred rites at the temple of Venus, which is where she first encounters Leander, from lines 161 to 198. In lines 199 to 384, very long section where Leander is trying to persuade her to be with him, and Hero, of course, refuses at first. And then lines 385 to 484, we get this long digression, almost 100 lines, on Mercury, Cupid, and the Fates, and I'll talk more about that digression a little later. When George Chapman wrote his continuation of Hero and Leander, he tripled the length of the poem, and he divided it into something called sestiads after Hero's town of Cestus. The first sestiad consists of these sections that I've identified here through line 484. There's Chapman there on the left. He's most famous for his translations of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which came out in 1616. And that year he also published his translation of Musaeus's original Hero and Leander poem. He added 4 sestiads, so there are a total of 6 in Chapman's continuation, the first 2 being by Marlowe, and then the last 4 being by Chapman. And so let's talk about the second sestiad. Lines 485 to 570, Hero and Leander's first night together in her tower by the sea. Lines 571 to 636, morning comes and Leander returns to Abydos. Lines 637 to 710, he can't stand to be apart from Hero, so he swims across the Hellespont and along the way is accosted by Neptune. And then the last lines of the poem, 711 to 818, they spend their second night together and consummate their love. And that is the second sestiad of Hero and Leander using George Chapman's structure. So Marlowe's intrusive narrator occasionally interrupts the story to provide commentary on the unfolding drama and the poem's themes of love and courtship. One of the longest of these passages is lines 167 to 76, where the narrator asserts, "It lies not in our power to love or hate, for will in us is overruled by fate." His point is that sexual attraction is irrational, it's unfathomable, and beyond our control. It's a force in the poem personified by Cupid. The implications here are significant for Hero, who falls in love with Leander despite herself. From the moment she lays eyes on him, any resistance will prove futile. And I'm quoting the poem here, lines 362 to 64. "At one self-instant, she, poor soul, essays, loving, not to love at all, and every part strove to resist the motions of her heart." So she can't help herself. So here are all of these lines that I've listed here come from Leander's speeches to Hero, trying to convince her to give up her chastity to be with him. And we'll go through these briefly. It's important. So nearly a quarter of the first sestiad, the lines 199 to 328, consists of Leander's attempts to persuade Hero to surrender to him. So throughout the poem, verbal persuasion prevails where physical force does not. Even Neptune seems to understand this during his failed bid to seduce Leander later. Leander hopes his rude words will lead thy thoughts as thy fair looks do mine. Then shouldst thou be his prisoner who is thine, he says. His first move in the lines listed here is to compliment her beauty. Observing the blood of the sacrificial doves running from the altar of Venus to Hero's feet, Leander says, "You exceed her far to whom you offer, and whose none you are." So telling her that she is more beautiful than Venus. Lines 225 to 246. So through a series of elaborate metaphors, hardly the language of simplicity and naked truth that he'd promised Hero moments earlier, Leander here urges her not to let her beauty go to waste. Lone women, he says, like to empty houses, perish. It is a motive he returns to again when he concludes his speech. He says, "The richest corn dies if it be not reaped. Beauty alone is lost, too warily kept." That's lines 327 to 28. Lines 259 to 68. So in this passage, Leander uses marriage as a metonym for sex. Sex is to delicious wine as virginity is to bland water, he says. More intriguing here are the lines immediately following this passage. comparing marriage and sex to wine versus virginity being water. Immediately after that, he compares marriage to the minting of coins. And I'm just pointing this out because it's so tempting to read these lines ironically in the light of Marlowe's counterfeiting activities in the Low Countries in the winter of 1592, for which he was arrested and could have been sentenced to death. Lines 269 to 76. So these lines are the first in a longer passage debunking the concept of virginity. So in this section, this first part, he emphasizes the abstract nature of virginity. He says, "Of that which hath no being, do not boast. Things that are not at all are never lost," he says. So it's just a figment. Virginity is this imaginary thing. It's not real. Classic ploy. Lines 277 to 282 continue this theme. It's an extension of the previous point. He argues that virginity is a passive trait, one that we are already born with, while virtue and honor, he says, are demonstrated or achieved through action. He says honor is purchased by the deeds we do. Lines 285 to 290. He says here that no one will believe that a woman so beautiful as Hero can be chaste. Vile tongues, he says, will rumor that someone or other keeps you as his own. Thus, to preserve her reputation and avoid what he calls swiftly blasting infamy, she should openly accept his legitimate love, which eventually happens, and she gives him some love tokens. She gives him a ring that's symbolic of her oath of chastity, which lets everyone know that they are together. Lines 299 to 308. Leander calls Hero a holy idiot for believing that chastity is proper to the worship of Venus, a goddess who he says delights in banquets, Doric music, midnight revel, plays, masks, and all that stern age counteth evil. Virginity, he continues, is a form of sacrilege against her deity. He also uses the word perjury, which is an interesting word choice. Lines 316 to 320. So finally, following up on the previous passage, Leander concludes that yielding to physical desire is the truest way to honor Venus. This is very predictable, of course, from the very beginning. He says, "Then shall you most resemble Venus none, when Venus' sweet rites are performed and done." He seems so confident in this speech, and then later he reveals himself to be something of a bungler in the art of sex. We'll take a look at that. So I'm going to put four sections up here in just a moment. So at about the halfway point of the poem, line 385, Marlowe inserts this long 99-line digression that has nothing immediately to do with the story of Hero and Leander. Instead, it's the story of the god Mercury's unrequited love for a country maid, very similar to Neptune's desire for Leander later. Just as Ovid uses the amours and animosities of the gods to explain certain features and conditions of the mortal world, Marlowe here invents a myth to explain how fate sometimes works in opposition to love. This is, of course, foreshadowing the doom that eventually will befall Hero and Leander, although he doesn't get to it in the poem. He breaks off before that point. The story is that thrown out of Olympus for stealing the nectar of the gods and giving it to a mortal woman, Mercury conspires with Cupid to overthrow Jove. And to execute this plan, Cupid ensures the three fates fall in love with Mercury. But after Mercury achieves his purpose and Jove is deposed, he does not return the love to the fates. He did despise the love of the everlasting destinies, we're told, which is why they scorn Cupid and refuse his request that Hero and Leander both might enjoy each other and be blessed. On a more personal note, and I think a more interesting one, Marlowe goes on to explain in this digression how the fates' disdain for Mercury, the god of learning, is why to this day is every scholar poor. And the wealthy, Marlowe says, will neglect genius, including presumably poetic genius, and instead reward ignorance. He says, and still enrich the lofty servile clown who with encroaching guile keeps learning down. So he says, wealth, riches and wealth never go to those who are most deserving. And genius and learning are never rewarded with wealth. And that sure does seem true today, doesn't it? Okay, so just 4 more passages I want us to look at here. And all of them are focus on the sexual encounters in the poem. This first section, lines 61 to 90, like Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis and Barnfield's The Affectionate Shepherd, Marlowe's poem contains passages of relatively explicit erotic encounters. Even though the subject of Hero and Leander is heterosexual desire, it is hard not to notice the more homoerotic passages in the poem, including the poet's description of Leander starting at line 51. Whereas Marlowe's earlier description of Hero focuses primarily on what she wears. These garments are so ornamental. They're so thickly described. It is easy to forget that there's a living, breathing body underneath all of this ornament. But when it comes to Leander, the focus is on the delicious meat of his body. And I encourage you to go back and look at the full passage, 61 through 90, which even men, the narrator tells us, find irresistible. Some swore he was a maid in man's attire, for in his looks were all that men desire. A great couplet that reminds me of Shakespeare's sonnet number 20. So lines 663 to 92, this is also on Leander now. This is the point where he has leapt into the Hellespont and is swimming from Abydos to Cestus, and his physical allure nearly leads to his destruction. Because along the way, the sea god Neptune falls in love with Leander, or at least falls in lust with him. That is one of the words that Marlowe uses with Neptune, lust. It's a scene that in places is strongly reminiscent of Proteus's abduction of Florimel in Book 3 of The Fairy Queen. So if you made that connection yourself, congratulations. So in this passage, Neptune is kissing and fondling Leander as he's swimming across the Hellespont. And when Leander rejects these advances, Neptune does something rather odd. He begins reciting an eclogue about a shepherd's love for a boy, and the purport of it seems to be that there is mortal danger in spurning the love of a god. That seems to be the direction that it's going. But we never find out for sure because Leander interrupts him before he can finish the tale. With daylight waning, he sees the sun going down, and he's like, yeah, I gotta go. So he redoubles his efforts to complete the swim, to get across the Hellespont before nightfall, leaving behind an enraged Neptune, who finally throws his trident at him, and then regrets it, and it comes back and wounds him in a really strange scenario where Neptune is bleeding in the water. And then Leander feels remorseful about it, and and Neptune says, "Oh, he does love me. He cares about me. He sees that I'm hurt. He cares about me." And he swims off to go find some gifts from the bottom of the sea to give to Leander. But Leander's, he's already forgotten about it and moved on and gets to shore at Cestus to be reunited with Hero. Reading this scene, one wonders if Marlowe is not setting the stage for Leander's death later in the story when he's swimming across the Hellespont yet again, guided by a light that Hero has set to guide him across the waters at night. And perhaps Marlowe intended to have Neptune play a more direct role in Leander's death as the spurned lover who gets his revenge. We'll never know, because Marlowe didn't finish the poem or just at some point chose to let it stand as it is. When George Chapman wrote his continuation that appeared in 1598, he has Neptune try to save Leander rather than playing a role in killing him. Neptune tries to save Leander from drowning, which of course fails because the fates have decided that Leander must perish. So lines 532 to 560, now we're talking about Leander and Hero's two sexual encounters. Unlike the almost predatory Neptune, Leander, particularly in this first encounter, hardly comes across as an arch seducer. His sexuality is fierce and it's urgent, but it's also very naive, rude in love, and raw. That's how Marlowe describes it. And we see the truth of this in this passage, 532 to 60, describing the pair's first sexual encounter. Despite the fluency of Leander's appeals to Hero, when it comes time for him to do the deed, when it comes time for him to act on his desire, he fumbles. He's uncertain how he's supposed to proceed. He supposes that there's nothing else to be done. He only suspects, we're told, some amorous rites or other were neglected. And then finally, natural instinct kicks in and begins to drive his actions as Hero struggles against his physical imposition of his will on her. The more she strived, the more a gentle, pleasing heat revived, which taught him all that elder lovers know. So, sort of by natural instinct, through the kind of physical tussle that they're engaged in at this point, it is creating the heat that is awakening the natural instinct to perform. But it doesn't happen yet. Hero manages to extricate herself from the situation, and there is a delay until their next encounter, a couple hundred lines later, lines 751 to 84. This is when they meet again after Leander recrosses the Hellespont, and he's not too exhausted to pick up where they left off earlier. Hero puts up a futile resistance. Futile because Marlowe tells us she wants it as badly as he does. The evidence for this is that she thinks the best chance of escape is to get into her bed, and that the best place to hide from Leander is under the blankets. So the more she struggles, the more she sort of reveals herself as wanting it, is how Marlowe pitches it to the reader. So a more confident and sexually competent Leander finally prevails, not by force, we are told, but by gentle parley. Nevertheless, Marlowe's language here, the language of warfare, building and intensifying, starting around line 755, and then culminating with the consummation of their love in a really violent image, comparing the trembling hero to a slaughtered bird that forth plungeth and oft flutters with her wing. That this kind of language, I think, raises troubling questions for contemporary readers, certainly something we can talk about as a class. So before I end this video, I want to show you this is the end of Musaeus's Hero and Leander. This is how the story ends, and I'm using George Chapman's translation, which appeared in 1616, the year that Shakespeare died, interestingly. Every way tossed with waves and air's rude breath justling together, Leander was crushed to death. No more his youthful force his feet commands. Unmoved lay now his late all-moving hands. His throat was turned free channel to the flood, and drink went down that did him far from good. The morning shined, yet not by her light hero her love could find. She stood distract with miserable woes, and round about the sea's broad shoulders throws her eye to second the extinguished light, and tried if any way her husband's sight erring in any part she could descry. When at her turret's foot she saw him lie, mangled with rocks and all embrued, she tore about her breast the curious weed she wore, and with a shriek from off her turret's height cast her fair body headlong, that fell right on her dead husband, spent with him her breath, and each one other in the worst of death. And that concludes this lecture on Christopher Marlowe's Hero and Leander.